Our next speaker has been fighting the bad guys for a generation. Jack Blum, you were involved in the Lockheed bribery scandal in the 70s, I believe. You've been at the Senate Antitrust Commission, Subcommittee, sorry, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And you will be talking to us about legal privilege and international tax planning. You are now at the Tax Justice Network USA, and I'm sure you will provide us with yet another aspect of this fascinating topic.
I'll try to. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. I've actually been in Bergen when there's been 5 days of sunshine. So I've had the miracle of Bergen, and I'm getting used to Bergen as it usually is. I'm going to begin this afternoon by talking about an incident in Cochabamba, Bolivia. I was invited to speak on legal ethics at a conference of the Inter-American Bar Association in Cochabamba. And this was at a time when Cochabamba was on the edge of rioting because the World Bank had told the Bolivians they had to sell their water system and privatize it. And the new company, an American company, Halliburton, no, actually an American engineering company, had taken over the system and imposed water rates, that is the cost of buying water. There was about half the annual income of the average citizen of Bolivia. And this, of course, was untenable. But meanwhile, here was a conference of lawyers in Cochabamba, and I was to talk on legal ethics. And I started out by saying that the obligation of a lawyer, I was taught in law school, is to assist a client in obeying the law of his society. That the first obligation is to teach your client what is your obligation under the law of your society. And you're not to take him into the gray area and say, look, this is how far you can go and push it. You're to keep him in a zone where he's clearly behaving legally. Secondly, you're not supposed to answer the question, what are my chances of getting caught? You're supposed to tell him, no, you can't do that. And if he wants to push into that zone of what are my chances of getting caught, you really should be finding a new client. The audience of lawyers in Cochabamba began to laugh at me. You know, what kind of idiot has come from America to tell us this? Because we all understand that our job is how to get around the law, not how to help people obey the law. Now this is an extraordinarily important proposition because really adherence to the values of a society is what makes a society work. And if you don't have people who adhere to the values of the society, you have chaos, impossibility, and a place that no one really wants to live in. We actually have a system for trying to ensure that people obey the law, and it's a criminal justice system. We punish people, and societies for all time have been perfectly capable of saying, we'll take away your property, we'll take away your liberty, and in extreme cases, we'll take away your life if you don't adhere to the values of our society. Now, that is the way we bring about social control. If lawyers don't help make that system work, if what they do is try to find ways to take people out of an area where they have those responsibilities and are answerable legally, the society begins to break down. And what we've got now is a situation where the legal profession is adhering to the values of what yesterday Prime Minister Papandreou referred to as the Republic of Richistan, as opposed to the republic in which you live. The values that are being talked about are, how do I get around laws by working the international system so that I find a way that either I have no personal responsibility in the jurisdiction that I'm operating in, or I pay no tax in the jurisdiction I'm operating in, or I have no responsibility to the society in the place that I'm operating. And if the lawyer takes on that role, I believe it's a fundamental ethical violation. I'm going to shift here to talk a little bit about how that proposition has been put into play by the legal profession. I'm old enough to remember the history and evolution of corporate law. For a long time, in British common law, in American law, the only way you could do business was as a partnership. Partnerships required unlimited liability, so that if you went into a business and you failed, you went into a contractual obligation, and you couldn't pay your bills, you were personally responsible. When the American Constitution was written, we wrote in ideas of bankruptcy, which is to say that you couldn't be put in debtor's prison for failure, let's say, in a business venture. And the idea here was to make it easier for people to take risks and develop new enterprise. A very noble idea, I think. And then we took it further and began to develop, and this happened in other parts of the common law world, the notion of a corporation, which could have two advantages. One, limited liability, that is, limited financial liability, and in addition to limited liability, perpetual life, so that you could keep this corporation in business. It didn't die with the death of a partner. It didn't die with the departure of a partner. Well, what's happened is that we have gradually taken the notion of corporation, which was very tightly controlled by the state when it originally came into being, and expanded it to the point where it's become the vehicle, along with other devices that have been invented, for separating individuals for responsibility for their actions. We've gone a long way in separating the act from real responsibility. And it's wrecking, I believe it's wrecking parts of our society. And it's not just in the area of taxation. If it were just taxation, it would be one matter, but it's in multiple areas. And let me give you a number of examples. In the recent financial crisis, you probably noticed that it was very difficult to pin down where the transactions occurred. Where were the shadow banks? Where were the contractual arrangements that were set up that were bankrupting the financial institutions? And suddenly you began to realize, if you dug into what was going on at a bank, that a bank wasn't a bank. It was 700, 800, 900 separate corporations sort of moving along in close formation. And these corporations were in multiple jurisdictions with very different kinds of rules, and in some cases included entities which had no owners, no one responsible for them. We discovered things like that in Enron. There were actually corporations that were set up, one particular in Jersey, I recall, and I think it was the Enron affair, which had no owners. And there were letters to that effect, that there were no owners. And all of this was to make liability disappear. Well, all of this didn't happen accidentally. Lawyers were here working for, as I called it earlier, the Republic of Richistan, putting distance between responsibility to the society and the state away from the individual and making it disappear in a welter of entities which no one could get their arms around and no one could do anything about. This is a shift which I think has really brought tremendous trouble to our societies. And there's some more things here to consider as we think about what it means. I'd like to talk just for a minute about the insurance business. In the United States, insurance is a matter of state law, and insurance companies are required to have certain fixed reserves to cover losses. So if I'm going to insure people's houses against damage from a hurricane, according to American law, by agreement, an insurance company has to have reserves that are sufficient to cover a once-in-100-year event. Well, the insurance companies don't like that much because we've had quite a number of once-in-a-100-year events. So now what they've come to be doing is writing reinsurance contracts. So wait a minute, what we're going to do is give up part of our premium income to insurance companies that are operating offshore. Bermuda's a favorite. And guess what? In Bermuda, an insurance company is only required to have reserves for an event that occurs once in 500 years. Okay? And now we've neatly sidestepped requirements that were designed to protect the society. Is it legal? Of course it's legal. Is it right? That's a question which most people won't even know to ask because these arrangements are not at all clear. They're very complicated arrangements. They're not very public. And no individual who's buying an insurance policy for a house has the time or the capacity or the capability of figuring it out. And so it goes with tax planning as well. It's financial regulation, it's tax planning, it's liability as well for incidents that cause tremendous damage to society. You may recall we recently had a blowout in the Gulf of Mexico. This was the oil rig that BP had. And the oil rig was owned by a drilling company called Transocean, a company fairly well known here in Norway, it being the target of a tax matter. But Transocean, shortly after the blowout, ran into a court in Houston, Texas, and asked for a declaratory judgment limiting its liability to about $175 million. And that was based on the fact that the rig, the drilling rig, was a ship. And as a ship under maritime law, the losses it's liable for are the value of the ship and no more. And not only was it a ship registered in the Marshall Islands. Wait a minute, how did that happen? Transocean's headquarters are in Houston. But no, if you look at its documentation, in the year 1999, it inverted and became a Cayman Islands corporation. And by doing the inversion, it managed to move all of its profitability and dividends to a place where there were no taxes. And now it could become one of those disappearing chimera arrangements where everybody could look at it through a different lens and see nothing. We had Google goggles, but without the goggles. We had multiple enterprises, but the business is still being run from the same place, by the same people in the same way. Only when it comes to liability, they're working from the Marshall Islands, and when it comes to taxation, they're working from the Cayman Islands. And when it comes to looking at the company, I feel like I'm a little bit drunk because I can't figure out what I'm looking at. This kind of corporate arrangement is now the commonplace for everything. If it were only Transocean, it's every large bank, it's every large insurance company, it's almost every large enterprise on the planet. And what's happened is they all have teams of lawyers whose objectives are minimizing tax, eliminating liability, and with it, eliminating responsibility. One of the most appalling and pressing questions of the financial crisis in the United States is, why hasn't anybody been prosecuted? Why haven't people gone to jail? There have been hundreds of situations where the securities that were sold and resold on various markets and sold over the counter from one firm to another were obviously fraudulently presented. You know, the fraud was absolutely classic. And you say, well, where were the prosecutors? Why didn't they do anything? And you'd go in and ask that and have that conversation with the prosecutors, and then you say, well, whose law governs? This instrument was an instrument that was done in the Isle of Man, and it was sold by a British subsidiary to a hedge fund that was operating out of Cayman. And, you know, who's responsible and whose job is it to prosecute and who has the resources? And if we really try to get to the bottom of it, where are the records? How will we get them? How much time and money will it take? And in the end, who is responsible? Who did it? Which individual in the company? Was it the guy who sold it on the phone? Was it the person who up top said, yeah, this is a good system, it's okay, go ahead, do it? And if so, how do we find that person? There's a notion that somehow these hundreds of entities that are floating around that comprise this large corporation each have a body of their own, a board of directors. Well, some of you here in this room were with me in Miami at a conference put on that's called Offshore Alert. And at this conference we had panels, discussion panels, that included lawyers and offshore service providers who were talking about the question of responsibility of one of these offshore shell corporations in the event of a bankruptcy or a fraud or a liquidation. And in the discussion it became clear that the first thing that any service provider requires of their client, that is to say, if I walk in and say, set up a shell company, the first thing they want me to sign or put in the contract is that they have no liability for anything the company does. They'll provide all the directors, they'll provide all the officers, they'll keep the books, but they say, sorry, we're not responsible for anything the corporation does. Well, who is responsible? They're the directors, they're the officers. And in the end, you can't find out who's responsible. And that was the complaint of some of the lawyers who were talking about it, who are liquidators, who are trying to go after people to find the disappeared money. So, you know, who are these lawyers who set up this complicated offshore structure? And what are their ethical obligations? I want to turn for a minute to a problem that I encountered when I worked with a whistleblower who was going to IRS with a lot of information. And what he had was an offshore planning document for how to structure a deal to make about $2 billion worth of income disappear. And this was income that was pretty obvious, and the transactions had already occurred. So this advice was after the fact. It was, hey, you better undo all of these things you did and let's redo them, and if we redo them this way, there won't be any liability for what there would have been if you keep them in the situation they had been before. Now, I thought to myself, here's a lawyer who clearly deserves to be disbarred because the transactions had occurred and they were actually organizing and perpetrating what I would say is a criminal tax fraud. But the problem was, whose bar had that responsibility? Because the target was the US, the law firm was British, and the reorganization and the crap that was in that letter that suggested how to do all of this was aimed at restructuring companies in the European Union. Who's responsible? Which lawyer? Which set of rules? And here we have the law firm working for Richistan and no responsibility on the part of the individual lawyer to the society that he's part of. He's working to separate the people who are doing the deal from their responsibility to their society for tax, for any damage that might be caused, for any outcomes. And that, I submit to you, is absolutely unethical and antithetical to the role of the lawyer and totally damaging to our individual societies. Now, I've given a lot of thought to the problem of why we accept this and what the argument has been for accepting this sort of craziness. Well, part of it is that we've had a lot of trouble with the state. You know, if you go back through the history of the 20th century, we've had criminal states. World War II was fought over a criminal state. We had a state in the former Soviet Union that thought nothing of having, 10, 15 million of its own people starve to death because the dictator in charge of the state had the idea that that was the way to go. We've had a head of state in China that allowed 30 million people to die of starvation because he had a strange and warped idea of development. We've had states that have confiscated people's property with no explanation, no rights, no rule of law. And the idea that people should have a refuge for their persons and property from a criminal state have led us to accept, at some level, quite a bit of flexibility in moving money around and taking it away so that a state can't arbitrarily confiscate what belongs to the individual. That proposition is set on one side and used as the argument for rigid bank secrecy, for preventing any sort of look-through of the kind of thing I've been talking about. The preceding speaker talked about balance. Well, I think that there is balance. There is an opening for balance. But the balance has now swung so far in a direction of destruction, of undermining the possibility of the state to provide for its citizens, to protect its citizens through the use of criminal law, to make people adhere to the common values, that we have to find a way to bring the balance back. And this is personal and individual responsibility that I'm talking about. We can't anymore have businessmen whose home is a jet flying at 30,000 feet or a 200-foot yacht who have a squad of lawyers who explain to them how to do business anywhere and everywhere with no responsibility for any consequence. That isn't what you should do. Unfortunately, that kind of lawyering has become the best paid lawyering. That kind of lawyering has been where my colleagues make the most money. And it is a wonderful few of my colleagues who are able to walk through the labyrinth that's laid by these other fellows and recover money when it's stolen, find the proceeds of crime, find the stuff that's gone wrong, and get some manner of restitution. So when my friends here who've gone after a batch of money spend 5 years, 10 years of their lives chasing the money and trying to get it back, and they triumph, it's really quite remarkable. But we shouldn't have to do that. We shouldn't have to have a 10-year run. And some people in the discussion of that asset recovery yesterday were talking about the problems of getting back just a fraction of that money, and what could you do to really make it impossible to get it. And I kept thinking, you know, what's wrong with our banking system that the day after Ben Ali is out as head of the government in Tunisia, somebody says, oh my God, shock, we've just found $6 billion of his money in our bank. Wait a minute, why didn't you know about it the day before he went out of power? What did happen to all of the money that the Mubarak family got out there? And why are we worrying now about, well, how do we find that money? Surely the bank involved took it in, and they knew what to do with it, and they knew whose it was. Now, of course, again, those colleagues of mine at the bar who are divorcing responsibility from individuals, separating the individual from responsibility for their actions, have done both things. They've protected the Mubarak money from those who would recover it, and they've protected the bank. And they've given the bank the structure to help Mubarak hide the money. What will we do with those lawyers? So what I appeal to you today to do and to think about is how to get my profession to go back to what its job is, which is teaching people how to obey the law, how to find that place where we can tell people, if you behave this way, you'll be behaving honestly. And how we get to the position of not advising people, this is your likelihood of getting caught. And by the way, don't tell anybody I told you that. Right now, most of tax law depends on that idea of what are my chances of getting caught. And I will tell you, even after the UBS case and other cases, there are still clients coming into law offices asking, should they go honest? What are my chances of getting caught? And the truth is that no tax authority, no law enforcement authority can catch every criminal if every criminal has to be prosecuted. The system depends on the honesty of half the population and the fear of another 40% of the population that they'll get caught if they do wrong. And what we do is prosecute the dumbest and most egregious of the remaining 10% to put fear in the heart of the 40%. The way the system is working today, the fear is missing, the capacity to enforce is missing, the complexity of working through the international system is overwhelming, and as a result, we have real financial catastrophe. I think we're talking about time for change, and time for change now. Thank you.